So, welcome everybody. Today we're talking with Gretchen the Fever Watson, and Gretchen is a clinical psychologist, correct, Gretchen?
Correct.
And she's a colleague of mine, and Gretchen's expertise is really in looking at adverse events of pharmaceuticals, overprescribing, polypharmacy, and she has worked particularly in pediatric populations. And
Mm.
she now works with the University of South Carolina on a sonar project. So, Gretchen, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work? And then from there, we will have some questions for you.
Sure. Thank you. And it's great to meet Jennifer a couple years ago at a conference that deals a lot with the topics that we'll be discussing today, and we've been fast colleagues ever since. I'm a clinical and developmental psychologist and started my work really in infant psychology and never expected to be doing this work. But it's just unfolded where I used to assess infants and preschoolers for all kinds of problems, mostly developmental problems, sometimes sleep problems, or very early neurological problems as part of a big multidisciplinary team. And I did that in California with a team that was headed up by a developmental pediatrician. And we rarely, if ever, diagnosed ADHD. Then, as life would happen, the military moved him to Virginia Beach, the pediatrician, and the following year moved my family to Virginia Beach, and we ended up living a few streets apart. And he showed up on my doorstep when he heard I was in the neighborhood and said, "You've got to come back to work and help me start the same kind of clinic." So we kind of built the clinic together, multidisciplinary assessment at the Naval Hospital and the Department of Pediatrics in San Diego. Then we did the same thing at the Children's Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia Beach area. And in doing that, I thought I would be seeing the very same kinds of cases, which I basically was, and issuing the same kinds of diagnoses. But all of a sudden, once I was in Virginia and we were working in a for-profit system as opposed to a government-funded program, people were incentivized to give different diagnoses. And all of a sudden, the pediatricians were diagnosing kids with ADHD left and right. And I kind of questioned that and then kind of blew the whistle on that. And they just didn't have the same concerns that I did and basically poo-pooed my observations, saying, um, well, we're a new clinic and we have a referral bias that you're seeing, and we're dealing with a real pent-up demand for these kinds of services. So there's really nothing to worry about. And I said, no, this just doesn't make any sense. I'm hearing parents talk about ADHD at the, soccer games and cocktail parties and everywhere I go. So I just gathered some clinic data looking at our first 188 consecutive cases and said in 75% of these cases, you've diagnosed ADHD. That just doesn't make any sense. And that led to one thing after another. And I ended up designing in a big epidemiologic study that school nurses were just so eager to help me launch, because school nurses in the area had seen the same thing and they had expressed concern to their administrators who didn't take them seriously, because school nurses are kind of low man on the totem pole in school systems.
Mm.
And so they wanted to help because they said data is power. It's the first time I heard that phrase. And it was so true. So they thought, well, if we can help you collect data and you
Mm.
have data, then we can maybe make some difference. And so it was just such an incredible fluke that I had all these school systems in a very large metropolitan area wanting to cooperate with me to look at school records to see what the prevalence of ADHD drug treatment was. And I picked two of the most diverse school districts in the region, which together created a population that was characteristic of this entire Virginia Beach, Norfolk metropolitan area of about 1.5 million kids. And I had access to the school health records for every single student in these two school districts, one of them being one of the largest districts in the country. And the data confirmed my observations that
Mm.
children were being diagnosed at rates that were far, far higher than all the experts said was happening or was possible. And so that's how I, kind of transformed from being, an infant psychologist going in and teaching parents in the NICU how to hold and interact with their babies and assessing little kids and dealing with medical issues to trying to address the issue of overdiagnosis and overtreatment of psychological problems with
Mm.
drugs. And so it's been um, an interesting and bumpy ride, let's just say that. So that's kind of hope gives you some idea of what I do.
Mhm.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, and we met at the Farmed Out Conference, which is out of the Policy in the Public Interest Master's Program at Georgetown. I'm not sure the conferences are ongoing at this time, but Farmed Out as an initiative is still ongoing. And it was really an eye-opening conference. As somebody that works in integrative healthcare, I'm aware of the issues of polypharmacy and overprescribing. But what was very eye-opening was actually the amount of amassed data demonstrating, serious adverse effects from particularly overprescribing in vulnerable populations like kids, and just that the data is often suppressed, and that there are market forces at work.
Mm.
I think, Jennifer, what you're saying is key. In fact, I just made a few little notes of things maybe we would talk about. And I think that is one of the key issues to make sure people understand is the extent to which the scientists and the evidence that don't jibe with corporate interests get suppressed. It's not that we're just ignored or, run roughshod over. We are actively suppressed by very powerful forces, and it's just really hard to get valuable information in the hands of parents and patients when they're having to make critical decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. If I can ask, one of the things that it seems to me whenever I visit my mother who's in assisted living, the TV, almost all the commercials are for one disease or another, and half of them you never knew you had. And it's like, is my leg restless? I'm not sure. I mean, I do move around once in a while. Maybe I've got, and there's this desire to push onto the public all these drugs. And it makes me think, long COVID is sort of like this cluster of long-term sequela effects from COVID. And the insurance industries love to say it's not a real thing, but I guarantee you that if they came out with a drug tomorrow to fix it, suddenly it'd be a real thing because they could pay for it. It'd be a market. There's people out there. They could advertise it. It seems like we've got the pharmaceutical industrial complex.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great way to explain um, this medicalization of things, that if they did have a drug for it, it would be acknowledged. And interestingly enough, just side note, um, I found a 1988 journal article in a very reputable peer-reviewed journals that was called something about post-viral syndrome, and said,
Mm.
we need to stop renaming this every 10 years. We've known forever and a day there's this thing called post-viral syndrome, that a certain percentage of people who get a virus have a long version of the virus. And when they described in 1988, what post-viral syndrome was and the different things that had been called over the years, it was long COVID. So, we've made it sound like it's something new, and but it's half denied. But sure enough, there will be a drug designed for it, because otherwise they wouldn't even bother to name it.
Right.
Right, and one of the things that was discussed at Farmed Out was invented diseases, right? So that
Mm.
if it's like a backdoor strategy, if there is a drug that's developed and it's found not to be effective, perhaps for what it was originally developed for, it will be remarketed for something else. And
Yeah.
that's very, I think that's something that the general public also doesn't know about.
Right, right. So I've heard said, and maybe you all can confirm this, this was a while ago, that basically there hasn't been any new drug developed since about 1965 or something like that, 55, 65, something like that. All they're doing is tweaking the same old drugs, repackaging, remarketing, and renaming and rebranding for different diseases.
Wow. I hadn't
Yeah.
heard that. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, isn't it?
You
Wow.
know, you go into
Yeah,
the pharmacy and say, "Can I have the 1965 version of this, please?"
right, right. And a lot of them were around and they didn't work for what they were
Mm,
intended for. So they sit on the shelves until, as Jennifer's saying, somebody can say, hey, maybe we can get this to work for X, Y, and Z.
mm.
Have a drug, we'll find a disease.
Well, and that's the story of Viagra, right? It wasn't originally designed for sexual problems. It was designed for something else. And someone said, "Hey, we have a side effect. Let's make it a drug."
Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
So many drugs that way. Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
Frank?
I, I mean, I
Oh,
mean, the first psychiatric drug was discovered that way. It was first used to I think, sedate surgical patients, and they realize, gee, this is like a chemical lobotomy, and it really is so subduing. Maybe psychiatrists would be interested in this.
a little scary.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about this whole trend of medicalization. I read a guy back in the 1980s or 90s named Ivan Illich. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. I love him. Doctors on Trial was, I think, like a 1975 book that he wrote.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, and he also had one called Medical Nemesis. And
that's
his
the one.
whole
Yes.
idea, he was calling out the medical profession and saying we're going too far with what is called diagnostic creep, I guess is what
Yeah.
he called it. And then more and more aspects of the human experience now have fallen under the umbrella of medical care. And it's gotten to the point now where if you've got a pulse, you're sick with something. And this has been recognized for what, the last 40 or 50 years, and yet it seems to be accelerating.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a great point. We know it, we knew it was a problem. 75, how many years ago was that? Um, that's
Years,
more than
yeah.
a quarter century ago. And how does it keep accelerating? It just amazes me how easily we are duped by pharmaceutical marketing. And when I say we, I don't mean just the public. Doctors get duped.
Hmm.
Everybody gets duped, and it's like they distract us from the real issue at hand. And I've said to Jennifer, she's heard me say, the bottom line is we're talking about psychological and cultural problems when we look at psychotropics. Why, when we're talking about something that's psychological or sociological or cultural, do we think the answer is to give a medical diagnosis and a drug? I mean, that
Hmm.
just doesn't even make sense. These are not that's illogical.
Hmm.
Very
Hmm.
illogical. And one of the most shocking ones to me, Gretchen, I'm not sure if you're even aware of this, but there are journal articles trying to promote a reframing of grief as chronic addiction to the person who's passed away. So
No.
they're trying to promote addiction
Oh,
medicines for people who are grieving. And what's so profoundly
wow.
disturbing about that is that grieving is a natural process and it's a necessary psychological process. And so if one suppresses the process of grieving, the person never actually reaches any closure or any sense of having navigated or integrated that experience of having lost a loved one. So this is how extreme it can get. And to me, it's part and parcel with our for-profit healthcare system because, there was a time when pharmaceutical advertising was not allowed on television. A lot of people don't remember that time, but it wasn't that long ago. And there was a time when you had 30, 45 minutes with your doctor. I mean, what was needed is what you received. Now, it's not physicians' fault. They're subjected to moral injury from having to try to provide care in a 15-minute time slot. Everything in the physician's practice is reduced to relative value units. That's how they're paid. It's really an assembly line model of medicine. And then all you can really do in 15 minutes is write a prescription. So it's structured to promote this type of pharmaceuticals as market-driven solution.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you're a little generous when you say they're allowed 15 minutes per
Oh
patient.
yeah, yeah.
I was going to
That's
say, who's your
not
doctor?
around here. That's not what they're given.
Right.
Absolutely not. And also speaking of putting these things in historical context, it wasn't that long ago that we were not expected to go to the doctor every year or 6 months, 3 months, or whatever. This idea of an annual checkup for healthy adults just didn't exist. And so we are forcing people into the medical care or medical, injury system, whatever you want to call it, the medical system, who are perfectly healthy, who are getting screened and tested for all kinds of things, looking for problems, many of which really would be incidentalomas, would go away on their own, people would just deal with whatever. And instead, we're clogging a system with unnecessary appointments. And then somebody does have a acute illness going on and they want to get in to see a doctor and they can't get in.
That's exactly right. People are saying, it's months and months to see certainly a specialist, but sometimes your primary care physician as well. And so that's leading to avoidance of the medical system altogether, which is very problematic for people that actually have treatable conditions. And it's leading to attrition from the medical profession and all the allied health professions. So, and I think I mentioned this to you, Gretchen, but recently I was additionally alarmed to hear from my PCP. Something fell on my clavicle and it was a little, painful. So I wanted to go get a diagnostic x-ray just to make sure there wasn't a fracture that was and with the imaging came from the imaging center, something that said arthritis in the shoulder. Well, I wasn't getting my shoulder imaged at all. I had no complaints with my shoulder. I don't have arthritis in my shoulder. But my primary care physician said, if they don't give you some type of diagnosis, insurance won't pay for the image. So now people are being overdiagnosed with conditions they don't have. Apparently, it's not an option to say, we screened this person with this image and then they have nothing because insurance won't pay for it. So you end up with information in your medical chart that is irrelevant and inaccurate.
Right.
And since medical charts are kind of, quickly becoming part of the surveillance system, we are all sort of labeled with things which we likely perhaps don't actually have.
Yeah, and I wish that weren't a new problem, and maybe it is in some areas of medicine, but in psychology, it's not. So if we go back to the late 90s here in Hampton Roads, there was a lot of shifting to HMO kind of care and the like. And at that time, I was still doing and believing in all these, psychological assessments that I was doing lots of psych testing, neuropsych testing of kids. And I could spend 6, 7 hours putting a child through a battery. And then if I came up with a diagnosis like parent-child problem, oppositional defiant disorder, something like that, I would not get reimbursed. The whole assessment was, out the window, not fundable. But if I gave a diagnosis of ADHD, it was reimbursable. So, and everybody in the community, mental health community, learned that very quickly. And psychologists who I had looked up to at the time would say very casually, oh, I just give kids a diagnosis of ADHD. It's innocuous. And back then, they really thought doing so was innocuous. And even if it led to the kid getting on Ritalin, they thought that was innocuous. And the consequences of giving people labels and even an entry-level psych drug like a Ritalin or Adderall is not a benign event.
Mm, yeah. It strikes me when you talk about only having a few minutes with a physician, and then of course that's enough time to write a prescription. It seems like it's almost triage by prescription. They got no one. It's in software sales. We used to say nobody gets fired for buying from IBM or Microsoft, right?
Right.
So you always go with the big known thing that they're, like saying it's ADHD. You're not going to get punished for that. You're not going to get scolded for that. You're not going to get written up for that or an ethics review. But it seems to me that it's just easier to write the prescription for the general ball, like shotgunning a prescription, and then that's, on to the next patient. And they're just there in some sense, as you said, Jennifer, moral injury. They're doing the best they can with the way the system is confining them more and more and more, almost like a python slowly strangling the medical system.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. Oh, well, you were talking, I was thinking something back to Frank's point about the guy who wrote Medical Nemesis. Um, and hopefully it'll come back to me. I was thinking there was some great connection there, where it's you're saying diagnosis by prescription. Um,
Hmm.
it is diagnosis by prescription. Everything is reduced to a symptom. So we just have symptoms, and then somebody has clustered symptoms together. And once we have a symptom, we are looking for a prescription. That's it. There is no counseling other than required counseling. Did you speak to the patient about quitting smoking or reducing drinking or whatever? We have, I was telling Jennifer here in Hampton Roads, I don't know if this is true all across the country, but all of the OBGYNs, when you go in now, you get a 2-item depression screening. And every mother, when they take their child first year or two of life, I'm not sure how long it continues, in for their well child check, gets a depression screening questionnaire too. And they are just mining the patient population for potential depression. And of course, once they have it documented, they recommend medication. And we have so many of the antidepressants that women are put on are through OBGYN or pediatricians now, even referring them to go get the medication. It's sad. So I had this friend of mine who's in her 30s, had just had her second child, and she was ticked off about being asked to complete these depression questions. And she's not in the field or anything. She's just kind of savvy, kind of very independent kind of person. And she asked me, will you go with me to my well child visit? I want you to see this. And so I did, and I sat there quietly, and the nurse, wanted her to fill out the questionnaire like you do for every single visit. And she said, no, I'm not filling it out. Well, you have to fill it out. No, I don't have to fill it out. Yes, you do have to fill it out. Well, let me talk to the doctor. And then the doctor came in. Well, why don't you want to fill it out? Well, and she's going on and back and forth and back and forth. And I finally asked the doctor, I said, what do you do with that information? He said, it just goes into the system. I said, who's looking at that data? He said, I don't know. I said, don't you think that's kind of research without consent if you're not looking at things retrospectively? Somebody's looking at that information for a reason. He just blanked. He didn't even know how to respond to that.
Hmm.
And then this young mother said, how about this? How about you develop a relationship with me as a parent
Hmm.
of your patient? And I bet you'll be able to figure out if I have a problem with depression.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so the pediatrician said, I'll tell you what, I'll fill this out for you. And that's how it ended.
Wow, that's that seems like an ethical breach right there.
Of course
You
it
have a
is.
non-consenting patient who's chosen not to fill it out, and the doctor's filling it out for the patient. So that's very problematic. But
Wow.
one of the things that I know that you know and have mentioned, Gretchen, is that putting especially kids on a stimulant particularly if they actually do not have a legitimate diagnosis of ADHD or um, is actually is extremely problematic. Some kids become aggressive. Some kids become dependent on the medication. Some kids use it. They know they sort of realize experientially they don't need it for a condition, but then begin to use it recreationally. It goes into circulation sometimes in high schools. People sell it to each other, kids sell it to each other. And sometimes it is a gateway experience for other drugs because kids that don't need it are experiencing now basically a high. And so it's very problematic. And the thing that, is I think we don't talk about enough is that behavioral interventions are often have much better long-term outcomes than a pharmaceutical. Pharmaceutical is like a quick fix, and sometimes it's not a quick fix, but the idea is that, well, there'll be some kind of rapid change. But behavioral interventions, often when they're studied, they have sustainable outcomes that are diachronic and that can be maintained over time. So that's something that I know that you're.
Yeah, I'm all over everything you just said. I want to go back to the first thing you said, though, that kids who don't really have ADHD and get put on the medication are subject to all of these different potential problems. Well, even if a child meets the criteria for ADHD, they are subject to all the exact same issues. Those drugs do not differentiate how they affect somebody based on whether or not you have a DSM diagnosis. The DSM diagnoses are, clusters of behaviors that a small group of psychiatrists basically have voted on. And we've been searching for 50 years for some sort of biological marker for ADHD, and none exists. And when you think about that diagnosis, if you just even forget about the DSM for a minute, you go attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. We have lumped behaviors that deal with inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity under one rubric. And it's just nonsense to think that we're going to find some location in the brain that's going to be responsible for generating abnormal levels of those behaviors. Because even if you could link behavior to the brain, you've got this hodgepodge of behaviors, if you will, that are lumped together. So it's no surprise that they have not been able to find any genetic or neurological links to the diagnosis, despite every once in a while you'll hear a news report that they've just discovered X, Y, and Z. All of those have proven to be just, I don't know what to call them other than a farce, a joke, a nonsensical. There is absolutely no marker. So anybody who takes those medications, something as seemingly innocuous as a stimulant, is putting themselves at risk, which is, fine if a parent understands that and they want to choose that for their child, knowing full well what they're doing. The way it was explained to me is that every psychoactive drug, and this would include opioids as well as all of the psychiatric medications, work in a way in such that they all have different profiles, but all of them, we get our initial beneficial effects tend to, for most patients, be greater than the adverse effects. But the longer you take those medications, the equation that shifts so that over time you get less and less benefit of the drug and you get more and more of the adverse effect of the drug. And so when you really look at the drugs, all of them were designed for short-term use, but all of them have been used long-term. In fact, parents have been told, and now since the diagnosis of ADHD applies to adults as well, everybody's told this is a lifelong condition. You may need medication for the rest of your life. It's just such a lie to begin with, but you're setting a patient up for a life of medication that is going to, over the long haul, prove harmful. And you talk about gateway drug and addiction and selling these drugs on high school campuses. Well, it's now happening on middle and even elementary school campuses. There was a great study came out in 2023, national study conducted over a 15-year period of time, nationally representative sample of US middle schools and high schools. And they saw that the number of diagnoses of ADHD went up, the number of prescriptions for ADHD went up over that 15-year period, and so did ADHD drug abuse and, obviously addiction. And what they found was that the percent of kids in a school that have diagnosed with ADHD was predictive of the extent of prescription diversion and abuse. So the more children in a population that get diagnosed, the more abuse and addiction to those drugs
Mhm.
become a problem. And while that was
Wow.
universally true, the populations that were most at risk were populations where the school makeup was predominantly white and affluent. So it's like Virginia Beach, where I live. If, it's predominant, 2/3 of the population's white, it's, middle, upper middle income for the most part. No surprise, we have a huge number of kids on these drugs and a huge problem of drug addiction and abuse. And if you look at the gray literature now for drug rehabs, more and more of them are talking about kids who got into even heroin addiction where ADHD stimulants were their gateway experimentation drug. I mean, why we think we can put addictive drugs in the hands of young kids and impulsive teenagers and think this is going to be a good,
Right.
have a good outcome. I don't know.
Who thought this was a good idea,
Who thought this was a good idea? Yeah, it's crazy. And there's even more of a backstory to this that in the 60s and 70s, there were all these speed freaks and a big problem. We had an epidemic of addiction to stimulants. It was largely women who were getting them for weight control and some of the military who had gotten them for trying to stay awake for missions and stuff like that. And there was an effort to clamp down on how stimulants were used. And the DEA, I think it was called something else back then, they were looking to regulate the use of these stimulants. While that's going on, Keith Connors, who became, one of the most prominent names connected with ADHD, was working with Leon Eisenberg, one of the most famous child psychiatrists of the day. I forget if they were at Harvard or Johns Hopkins. I think they were at Hopkins. And they were looking at the effect of Ritalin on severely brain damaged children. And, oh, sorry, I didn't turn off my phone. And Connors had developed a tool to use as his checklist, and he's got this checklist at a time when the DEA is clamping down on how stimulants can be prescribed for adults. And a drug company, maker of Ritalin, approached him and says, "Hey, how about if we take your research tool and we turn it into a clinical scale that you can sell?" And so anyway, he got together with the manufacturer of Ritalin, and they basically helped him create what became the first ADHD checklist. And he went on to make millions off of that checklist. And so just as the ability for doctors to write prescriptions for stimulants to adults was being reined in, they created an opportunity to write prescriptions for stimulants to children. And together they talked the DEA out of restricting the use of stimulants for people who had ADHD. So that's, part of the orchestrated story. It's like this is such a marketable drug. And people like it. We sure don't want to lose all that money. We got to come up with a new diagnosis, a new avenue for keeping stimulants out there.
Wow. Right?
Well, getting back to Ivan Illich,
Yeah.
I yeah, I think his fear at the time was that the medicalization of society would come to obscure our natural strengths and our natural healing powers that are native to us. And this dovetails with our idea of what does it mean to be radically human. And we have this strength, this capability as animals, and the more we medicate ourselves and the more we subject ourselves to medical solutions to minor afflictions, the weaker we become. And that's what I see in the modern world. I see my parents' generation and my grandparents as being some pretty strong people. And I look around me now and I see a lot of really weak people. So does that dovetail with your experience?
Absolutely, 100%. I see it all the time. We're getting sicker, sicker, or at least we think we're sicker, but I think we really are getting sicker. And we are less resilient and less able to cope with it, which is partially, we're probably literally interfering with our natural capacity
Mhm.
biologically,
Mhm.
but we're also interfering with our natural capacity psychologically
Mhm.
and spiritually, if you will. You don't have to be religious. What people had beliefs that helped them heal.
Mhm.
And that is just not even part of the equation. You think about psychiatry was meant soul doctoring back in the day. The soul has been sucked out of modern psychiatry.
Yeah.
It it does not exist. And I just um, can't imagine if you're a child now, you're likely to be on multiple medications before you're out of high school.
Yes.
I mean, how does that help you when we know, if we look at the elderly, they deal with the prescribing cascade problem all the time, where you take one drug to fix one problem and it creates other problems. So you take other drugs to fix that problem. And there's this just compounding of problems. And then nobody knows how the drugs even interact with each
Right.
other.
Right.
And then you hear things like, oh, guess what? Taking, cholesterol medication um, seems to put you at greater risk for Parkinson's disease.
Right.
So now you get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, we take you off your cholesterol medication, but it's probably too late.
But you've got it's almost like in physics, you have the three body problem, right? Where you have three objects. You can do Newtonian physics with two, but getting the third one in there just takes it off the charts mathematically. Well, what happens when someone's taking seven drugs? Nobody,
Right.
no computer can figure that out. There's no large data set to figure out, are we going to give Mary Parkinson's by this or Alzheimer's by that or cancer because of these four drugs or what have you? And it seems, Gretchen, that I'm kind of stepping back a little bit from the problem that we're all kind of feeling around like, the different seven people on an elephant. It seems like we're under a time where we have this, what's the problem we're trying to solve with ADD, ADHD with the kids? I mean, they're highly contaminated with huge bioaccumulation of chemicals and drugs and even pharmaceuticals in the water. And, the emotional, psychological, spiritual, social media stresses, the competitiveness, the economy, politics, all this is a massive burden on these young brains, these young bodies. And here we are. It's like, well, I'm just going to give you this one thing and just set you out of here. You're good to go. And it's like, Gandhi said, we should, if people are drowning in front of you as they go by in the stream, we should go upstream and find out who's pushing them in. In other words, what are the causes?
Oh, that's a
That's
great,
really right. That's really generating all of this in young people, in these young, beautiful minds. And we're giving them drugs before their brains are even, that we don't know what they're doing to them. And their brains aren't even going to be, fixed solid for another decade after they start on the drugs or more.
I used to say that all the time. We're medicating them for behavioral control before they've had a chance to establish behavioral control.
Right. Yes.
That is when one of my pediatric colleagues first said to me that our level of Ritalin use was child abuse, I was still pretty young and naive as a professional and kind of gulped at it. But today I would say that is abuse. That is child abuse. I don't know any other way to think about it. And to put this in perspective, if you go back to 2000, we're talking a quarter of a century ago,
Right.
My research was kind of all over the local news and even some national news and maybe even over in the UK a little bit. So it was a very busy time, very active time. And um, Old Dominion University had developed a new parenting center, a big, beautiful parenting
Mm.
center. And it was headed up by a very beloved educator, kind of educator, psychologist, counselor in the area. And she approached me and said, Gretchen, we're doing these monthly parenting lectures, and we've been doing them for a couple of years now. And they'd done them long before the new building, but we've got the building now, and I'd like you to come give a talk on ADHD in the infant. I
Mm.
said, infant ADHD? Are you kidding me? No, absolutely not. I will not do that. But
Wow.
we have all these parents who want to do this. So she had this incredible daycare center, early childhood center, parenting center. It was all, university based, and it was the best place to go to in town. I said, Kitty, I cannot in good conscience do that. So anyway, we finally agreed that I would give a talk on ADHD in the very young child. And I went there and I gave the talk, and it was standing room only. They had never had standing room only before. We had a room full of parents of preschool aged children and younger whose kids had already been diagnosed or who they were considering a diagnosis of ADHD. And I tried to explain to them, you know, you're talking about in some ways infant temperament or
Yes.
early childhood temperament. Infant temperament is not stable. You can have a irritable infant who turns out to be a very delightful 2 or 3 year old. You could have a delightful, very placid infant that turns out to be a real crank. And that was my dissertation, was
Right.
on social origins of temperament. And you can see this very clearly. I worked in an Ainsworth strange situation laboratory where we'd study the quality of infant-mother relationship. And that was the most robust predictor of how the child's temperament evolved. So I said, you could have interact with your child in a certain way that exacerbates these problems, or we can help you find ways to interact with your child that will ameliorate these problems.
Mm,
But
mm.
to think because these problems exist, your child has a brain-based disorder that is permanent, fixed, and requires medication is just crazy. I mean,
You bringing up an idea that's kind of, I think, we don't, parents, and I'm not a parent, but I have seen a bunch of them, and they don't want to take any responsibility for the way their child is acting. In other words, what I mean by that is not that they should control their child like you would train a dog, but that the stress that the family unit is going through, the child, pre-verbal children don't have a way to express it. So how do they express it? Right? In nonverbal ways, in behavioral ways. And that gets, I mean, there's so many different things that influence that.
right. And I think part of the reason it seems like parents don't want to take responsibility for it is, I would say, parents have lost their confidence in their ability to
Mm,
know what to do for their children. It used to be a communal process, and people sat on their front porch, and the aunts and uncles and grandparents knew what was going on, and they could give feedback to the parents. And we've got families that are mobile all over the place. They're over, two-parent household. Not that I'm a two-parent household, I'm not against that. It's just a dynamic that is real. And so parents kind of aren't as sure of themselves. They don't have as much built-in support and community. So then they go to the experts, and the experts are really creating these problems,
right.
because the experts who get best known are those who deliver messages that sell medical services
Mm,
and medical products.
mm.
And it's just been so damning on so many levels. And I think we really shouldn't undermine the impact of parents losing confidence in their ability to parent. Like, stop and think, does this make sense to you? But they're afraid to harm their child.
Well, I think it's
Want to
also
create
the
trauma in
concept of
someone.
control of a child is very problematic, right? We should cultivate children and support them and give them space to room and grow. But controlling a child is by itself, I think, a very problematic sort of idea. And it undermines the premise, I think, of brain development, which is happening over a fairly long period of time and happens in stages. And as you mentioned, Gretchen, it's an ebb and flow. It looks like this now, and then it'll look like that, and then it's going to look like that. It's not all, even with one individual child, it's not always easy to anticipate what's coming. Children are they, as any parent knows, children keep you on their toes. The minute you kind of feel like, oh, I got this down, they'll just become really different the next day. So,
Right.
and I really don't want to throw any parents under the bus either, because I think a lot of what's happening is parents are, they're faced with systems that are working against their better instincts and their intuitive knowings and their ability to work with their children. I mean, schools are now very much constructed in a way to make oriented around productivity, child productivity.
Right.
And that is capitalism and the profit-driven nature of our society means that we think about children in terms of productivity, which is again just really contrary to what they need. And parents, schools typically, actually, I remember looking at a study once for when I think it was out of University of Colorado, but they did a study of when parents made a complaint against the school system, how it was decided. And 90% of the time, it was decided it was the parents' fault. 10% of the time, it was the children's fault. And 0% of the time, it was the school's fault. And that to me is actually probably a complete reversal of the an accurate picture of the situation, because schools take an oppositional attitude towards parents instead of working with them. Oftentimes they will deny whatever the resource is to the child, unless, like like we've been talking about, Gretchen, the child has an explicit diagnosis. And if a child, so it's a catch-22. Your child needs to have a diagnosis. But if you have a diagnosis, you better follow the conventional treatment path, which is pharmaceuticals, or they will point the finger at the parent and say the child's untreated.
Right.
So the parent is really in a quagmire of unwinnable situations. So I definitely don't want to throw parents under the bus. It's really challenging. And the unfortunate thing, Jonathan, is that the stresses that you described for children, the parents have the same ones, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very tricky situation. And I think the worst case scenario is when a doctor or a therapist or a counselor drives a wedge between the parent and the child by saying it's the parent's fault or it's the child's fault, thereby disrupting that very important dyad and that really critical relationship, by really basically casting it into a blame situation.
Right.
When on both sides, it's like you were saying, children raised communally in a traditional sense, there was support, there was encouragement, there was a diversity of resources available for the parent and the children to grow together, as human beings. So it's really very tricky these days, I think, to raise children in a society that doesn't see them as vulnerable beings in need of support and protection, but sees them as how quickly can we change them into a unit of productivity.
Make them into STEM scholars, And
Yeah.
I want to validate what you both said, by the way, which is the context of what I was trying to say was inartful because it's just not my domain. And I didn't mean like the parents have to control their children. I mean like the ability for them to deal with having, jobs, and maybe there's a single parent household, and, having to run around and take them to soccer and piano and everything else, and all the different stresses upon the parents that get reflected into the children because of the larger meta in society. And that
Right.
difficulty is translated into the children who don't have the means or the psychological development or even the wording to express themselves, and how that's showing up in terms of ADD or ADHD.
Right. No, I got that. I think it's very real. And I don't know if this is too off topic, but Jennifer, you kind of alluded to it a little bit, and it goes a little bit to what you're saying, Jonathan, too. I think in most school systems, certainly where I live, there's now a parent portal where every day information is posted about the child's homework, their grades, their scores, or whatever. And parents are expected to go check in on the parent portal every day. And on the one hand, we want parent involvement, but we're creating parent intrusiveness. And you're just undermining the children's capacity in so many ways. And even the idea of support and vulnerability. Yes, children deserve our support. We need to find the goodness in all of them and support them and nurture them and understand they are young and they are vulnerable. But vulnerable is a double-edged sword in a way. Yes, they're vulnerable, but they're also incredibly resilient, most of them, if we don't destroy their resilience. And by treating them like they're so breakable, we can't say no to them. We can't, discipline them, or let them know firmly and clearly that that behavior is unacceptable in the classroom or whatever. Um, we're doing them such a disservice. It's like we've lost our natural instincts. Back to what you're saying, Frank. We've lost our human instincts.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious if you've seen this TED talk. This was back when TED was first getting off the ground, and the fellow's name was Ken Robinson. And he was a creativity expert, and he was talking about his experience in the schools. And he told the story of this young girl who was highly distractible and couldn't pay attention in class and so on and so forth. And she got in trouble, and then they brought her into the principal's office, and she started she was in the waiting room, I guess, and was dancing to the music that was on the radio. And somebody observed, look, she doesn't have an attention problem, she's a dancer. And so then they made sure that she got the dance instruction, and she flourished, and she went on to become this world famous dancer and a multimillionaire, and was a total success. And so it wasn't an attention problem. It was she needed to move her body. And that, I think, is not emphasized enough.
Yep.
I couldn't agree more. Audrey McDowell, I think if I got her name right. Do you know her as a singer, musician? I might have her name anyway, she is absolutely fabulous. She basically is the same story. She was slated as ADHD. They were ready to put her on medication. They just hadn't discovered, her gift yet. She's a incredibly successful, wealthy, um, musician who's trying to give back to the community, who was rescued through music. And I just think we forget that our job is to help every person find their way in the world. And there's a
Yes.
way for everybody. Some people, maybe a lot harder to figure it out, but we have, like, doctors have reduced us to symptom lists and prescriptions. We are, as a society, I think, are reducing everything to, square holes and round pegs, and, we've got just a few options. You got to be X, Y, or Z, and you got to do it on this time course,
Mhm.
or else you're going to get a label and a drug. I mean, who does that? Who does that?
Well, I think,
Whatever.
a society that, um, your standardization is part of the profit motive. I mean,
Yeah.
when you can standardize people into units, like each patient is a relative value unit. I mean, it's not just like a theory of what may happen in the future. It's, a patient is this standardized set of symptoms. Or if you're a physician, it's a relative value unit. Or, or if you're in school, a child is, either succeeding or not succeeding, or not willing to see their individuality. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of is a recurring theme on Radically Human Conversations, is the importance of individuality and personal expression. And, the two things that were really deleted from the schooling experience in this in this country, as I think, somewhat concurrently with ADHD diagnoses going up, were arts and athletics. I mean, recess was taken away, lunch was reduced to, 15 or 20 minutes. Getting arts in the schools, especially movement, is really tough these days, and so it's, there are, kids have different ways of learning, and a kid that doesn't learn in a standardized way is often the best out of the box thinker or inventor type mind that you're going to find. So it is a
So,
shame.
so true. And I was doing a lot of school-based consulting when the standard of learning exams were implemented. And
Mm,
I watched the impact those had on the teachers' feeling about their ability to teach. They suddenly had to teach to the test
yeah,
instead of
yeah.
using their own creativity to figure out how they were uniquely going to deliver the material to the kids. And yes, borrow from other teachers who've had other great ideas, but teachers had latitude to teach the way they thought worked best. And maybe one teacher was going to do more literature and less math or whatever, and it wasn't as perfectly
Mm,
regimented. But by and large, I think it all worked out better when people were teachers had some more latitude too, because
mm,
our student outcomes have only gone downhill. They have absolutely gotten worse since you think about the Department of Education, politics aside,
mm.
wanting, people think, how could anybody dismantle that? But really, they're talking about giving money back to states to design things the way states and communities want. And that might not sound right, but the DOE didn't exist till I think 75. And ever since it's existed and grown, student outcomes get worse and worse because everything is standardized.
Yeah.
And we are just not meant to be that standardized.
So maybe we need a balance. Maybe we need to do some standardization so that we know that there's minimum sufficiency. Like in Switzerland, at 15, they have to decide, am I going to go into the trades? And, Jennifer, you brought up athletic and arts and music and all that stuff, but also shop and home ec, basic fundamental things. So many people are graduating from high school now doing things that I learned to do in shop. It's like that kind of stuff. And so we don't do any of that now. So people are, so they're not getting exposure to like things that could be very influential and positive for them. So that unique person doesn't get that experience because it's too standardized. But maybe we need a balance. What do you think where do we find the best practices? Where do we, move from where we are now to where we want to go?
That was what a great question. By the way, I don't know how you guys all got to know each other, but I want to know because I think each one of you is bringing up so many fascinating topics. I'm sitting here going, my God, somebody needs to write a paper on that. Somebody needs to write a paper on that. Somebody needs to write a paper on that. That. You guys are awesome. In terms of best practice, I don't know, but I'd be really curious to learn more from homeschooling parents because they seem to like maybe doing a balance of it where they have their kids are doing better on the SAT tests
Mm,
than kids in um, public schools. And so you kind of go, well, that's interesting. So
mm,
that's the standardized metric. We need some metrics, although that's late in the game. That's at the end, as you're ending your career. You really want something earlier so you know if kids need more help. But I think they are tending, at least around here, to adapt teaching to their kids' interests.
mm.
And they seem to be doing better. I don't I don't know.
Unfortunately, homeschooling is a point of privilege, right? You have to have somebody who's able economically to be home to teach the children. And so I think we can't treat it as if it's just accessible and available. And also, not everybody is a great teacher. I mean, I think we have to recognize that some parents will be great teachers that have they have a knowledge background and they have, kind of an instinct for working with younger people, and they'll do a good job, but not everybody. So I think we've got to think about,
Oh, I
you
agree. And I don't think
know,
that's the
options.
model, but I'm just thinking, have they figured out, the ones who are doing it well, have they figured out more of a balance? I mean, is there something to be learned there from
The
people
catering
who
to an individual, sure, because they have however many kids, not that many, right? In just the home setting. I mean, you think about the days of the one-room schoolhouse. If you've ever looked at the textbooks used back in like really the early part of, let's say the early part of the 20th century, they're very complicated textbooks. They're actually required a high level of knowledge acquisition. And they had really a variety of levels in the room.
Yeah.
So, um,
I'm no expert on this, Jennifer, but what's always struck me as it seems like looking back and how they used to teach kids in those situations, that they did go in depth on core subjects and there was less information. Our kids are subjected to so much information when really, if you get the basics down well in a couple subject areas, you can develop and flourish. So a lot of times they had a book, they would use it over and over and over again. When do our kids, after they get through, preschool, when do they read a book twice
Right.
or even read a book?
I think it's about teaching critical thinking. This is um, if you are taught how to learn and you're given options and you're taught to think critically, then yes, you have a better chance of learning additional things, as you move forward. And
Mm.
that, it's one of the really problematic things that's happening at universities now is that it's the courses that teach critical thinking that are really mostly under attack. So that's another topic,
Uh-huh.
but I think we've talked a lot. We started with pharmaceuticals, but now we're on education and child rearing, and it's all connected. I think that's the main thing that comes out of this discussion is that this is a sociological issue, and it's biopsychosocial and even spiritual to a certain degree because we have to value the individuality of the person. And I think that's a spiritual endeavor. So, yeah, I've enjoyed talking with you so much, Gretchen. I
Are we
appreciate
out of
it.
time?
I think
Yes.
we're getting
Can I
close.
just ask, how did you guys all connect?
Um, yeah, Frank and I know each other through through, I think it was Nova. Was it Frank?
Planetary Health Alliance or
Yeah,
something?
Planetary Health
Planetary Health
Alliance and
Alliance.
Nova, and then Frank has known Lo for a long time, and our other colleague John. So yeah, we just met, and we just enjoy talking to people and hearing about what how they're kind of contributing to the world in their own specific way and trying to make change. And these are tough times, so it's
Tough time.
nice to hear kind of what people have done that has had a positive impact.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, great. I really appreciated it. And, you don't hear many people talking about Ivan Illich and medical nemesis, but I got about halfway through his book, maybe last year. I think it's still sitting up on a stool in my upstairs that I'm going to go back and look at because I just thought this guy nailed it so long ago.
Nice.
Gotta
Yeah.
go
Nice.
get a copy of that, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Next on the list.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, this has been really great. Thank you. I'm very grateful. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I've got about 30 threads to follow up on. So
I know, I feel like we just scratched the surface and there's so much more, but thank you so much for asking me, Jennifer. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.